You really think your daughter's got what it takes? Let me save you the heartbreak. Harris, kids like her don't win in my dojo. And mothers like you? You're better off in the bleachers, keeping quiet and staying out of the way. Nate Brooks' voice boomed across the room, slicing through the rhythm of kicks and punches like a cold blade. Every word dipped in condescension and meant to cut deep. A few parents stifled awkward laughs. Others shifted uncomfortably. But Victor Caldwell didn't hide his smirk. His eyes lingered on Eleanor Harris with the smug satisfaction of a man convinced of his own superiority. The Elite Warriors Martial Arts Academy fell silent. The only sound the faint squeak of bare feet against the mats as everyone turned to see how she'd respond. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. And like this video so more people can hear stories like this. Now, let me take you to where it all began. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Chicago. The kind of day where the sunlight bounces off the glass towers downtown and the air carries that faint bite before winter. Eleanor stepped inside the academy like she had dozens of times before. Holding her gym bag in one hand and the strap of her coat in the other, her eyes locked immediately on her daughter Maya, 14 years old, moving with precision on the far mat. The kick Maya threw was textbook, clean line, perfect balance, sharp snap. But it earned her nothing from Nate but a curt nod and the flat word, again. Not 30 seconds earlier, Ethan Clark, a white student a year older, had thrown a kick that landed awkwardly with his heel, but Nate had grinned, clapped him on the back, and called him champ. Eleanor had been watching this for weeks now. The subtle but relentless way Nate's praise flowed toward certain students and his criticism landed harder on others. And it wasn't just Maya. Jamal Turner, a 12-year-old black belt hopeful, had been singled out that day too. You call that a block? Nate barked at him. My grandmother could do better. Seconds later, when Ethan made the exact same mistake, Nate simply chuckled and said, Don't worry, you'll get it. Eleanor's jaw tightened. This wasn't just tough coaching, it was a message. One that told every kid in the room exactly who mattered more. Off to the side, leaning against the railing like he owned the place. Was Victor Caldwell? He was the Academy's largest sponsor, a man who seemed to believe his checkbook entitled him to shape its culture. Victor's suit was tailored. His cufflinks gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights, and the faint scent of his cologne cut through the mix of sweat and minty floor cleaner. He'd been friends with Nate for years, and Eleanor had overheard enough to know that his idea of helping was pushing Nate to focus his energy on the kids he thought could bring the Academy prestige, which, in Victor's world, somehow never seemed to include the black and brown students. Today, Victor chuckled outright when Nate tore into Jamal. Only the strong make it, he murmured to the parent next to him, though his tone made it clear he had a narrow definition of strong. Lila Morales, Eleanor's best friend and fellow parent, stood at her side, arms folded tight across her chest. You seeing this? She asked in a low voice. Eleanor didn't answer, but her eyes stayed locked on the mat. She felt it, that familiar burn in her gut, the one she hadn't let rise to the surface in years. She'd buried that part of herself deep, under layers of PTA meetings, late-night homework help, and the quiet routines of motherhood. 12 years ago, in another life. The world had known her as Silent Thunder, 4-time MMA world champion, a fighter whose calm was as dangerous as her fists. Back then, she'd stepped into cages under the blinding lights of Las Vegas and dismantled opponents with precision and grace. But that part of her life had ended the night she got the phone call about her brother Daniel's accident. She'd walked away from the sport, changed her last name, and disappeared into a quieter life. Here, at Elite Warriors, she was just Maya's mom, and that was exactly how she wanted it. until now. Watching Nate chip away at Maya's confidence, seeing Victor encourage it, was like feeling a hand on her back pushing her toward a line she swore she'd never cross again. Nate glanced her way now, his smirk widening as if daring her to say something. He'd pegged her as harmless, maybe even intimidated by his black belt and his title of head instructor. He didn't know that every measured breath she took was a choice not to respond. Lila leaned closer. "You're gonna have to do something. Ellie. They're not just pushing Maya. They're trying to humiliate you too." Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin line. She could feel her pulse in her ears, her hands curling into fists inside her pockets. She thought of Daniel, of the way he used to grin and say, "Don't ever let them see you flinch." She thought of all the times she'd told Maya to stand tall, to speak up when something wasn't right. And here she was, standing silent while a man like Nate openly disrespected her and belittled her daughter. Then, as if to seal his own fate, Victor leaned toward Nate and said just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "You should give her a lesson. Call her out. Make it a show. The kids will love it." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward them, sharp and unblinking. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at Elite Warriors earlier than usual, slipping quietly into the back corner where the parents' bench sat against the mirrored wall. She wanted to watch without being noticed, to see if yesterday's display had been a one-off or if the undercurrent of favoritism still ran just as strong when the crowd was thinner. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the pattern to show itself. Nate was already on the mat, running the intermediate class through warm-ups. Ethan Clark stumbled on his footwork during a sequence of side kicks, and Nate chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair like an indulgent uncle. "That's all right. Champ, you'll nail it next time, not 5 minutes later." Maya hit the exact same misstep during the same drill, and Nate's face hardened. "Do it again. Harris, and focus. You're not here to waste anyone's time." Maya's cheeks flushed, but she bit her lip and repeated the move. From Eleanor's vantage point, the kick was almost perfect, sharp, controlled, and on target. But Nate gave only a curt nod before moving on. Victor Caldwell was there again too, leaning casually against the railing, sipping coffee from a gleaming silver tumbler. He caught Eleanor's eye briefly, his smirk curling just enough to send a message. He knew she was watching, and he wasn't bothered by it. Instead, he turned his attention back to Nate, leaning in to murmur something. Eleanor couldn't catch every word, but she heard enough. "Show her up, think she's tough," followed by Nate's low laugh. Lila slipped in beside Eleanor a moment later, coat still draped over her arm. "It's getting worse," she muttered. "You gonna say something?" Eleanor kept her gaze forward. Not yet. She wanted to see just how far they'd push it. Midway through class, Jamal Turner made a small error during a sparring drill, his guard dropping just a fraction. Nate barked at him like he'd committed a mortal sin. "You want to get knocked out? Keep that hand down and see what happens." Jamal's eyes dropped to the mat. 2 rounds later, Ethan dropped his guard completely, and Nate just laughed, tapping the boy's forehead lightly with his glove. "See? That's why you don't get lazy." The double standard was glaring, and Eleanor felt her hands curl into fists inside her coat pockets. The words she'd bitten back yesterday sat on the tip of her tongue. After class ended, parents gathered their kids and headed toward the lobby. Eleanor waited, letting the room empty before she approached the mats. She caught just enough of Nate and Victor's conversation to stop her in her tracks. "She's always sitting back there with that look," Nate said, "like she knows something I don't." Victor snorted. "Then call her out. Invite her to the mat. Make it fun. She won't last 30 seconds with you." Nate laughed, a low, dismissive sound. It'd be over in 10. They didn't know she was standing just a few feet behind them. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply turned, walked out the door, and headed home. But that night, sitting in her small apartment by the lake, she couldn't shake their words. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room as she pulled a worn shoebox from the top of her closet. Inside, beneath an old photo of her and Daniel, lay the black leather MMA gloves she hadn't touched in over a decade. She ran her thumb along the fraying edge of the wrist strap, remembering the feel of the cage floor beneath her feet, the roar of the crowd, the laser focus of a fighter who knew exactly who she was. The name Silent Thunder had once been etched in gold across the backs of fight posters. She'd walked away from all of it to protect her peace, to give Maya a normal life, to bury the part of herself that only came alive when the stakes were highest. But now, those same instincts that had carried her to 4 world titles stirred again, sharp and undeniable. Lila called just as Eleanor was setting the gloves down. "You hear what they said?" she asked without preamble. "I heard enough," Eleanor replied. "They're planning to humiliate you. Ellie, in front of Maya, in front of everyone." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then maybe it's time they find out exactly who they're dealing with." There was a pause. Then Lila's voice softened. "You sure you're ready for that?" Eleanor's eyes flicked to the framed photo of Daniel on the bookshelf. "I've been ready since the day I left," after hanging up. She opened her laptop and searched for an old folder of fight footage. There she was. Lighter, younger, eyes hard with focus, slipping jabs, landing clean counters, submitting opponents twice her size. The memories came back in waves, the adrenaline, the discipline, the quiet satisfaction of victory earned. She closed the laptop, stood, and began moving through the warm-up routine she hadn't touched in years. Her muscles remembered. Every strike, every pivot, every breath fell into place as if no time had passed at all. The next day, she'd be ready for whatever lesson Nate thought he was going to teach, and if he was foolish enough to challenge her, she'd give him one he wouldn't forget. That night, after the academy had emptied and the city outside her window had settled into its usual hum of traffic and distant sirens, Eleanor sat alone at her small kitchen table, the glow from a single lamp casting a soft halo around the worn wood. Her fingers traced the edge of the black leather MMA gloves lying in front of her, the same gloves that had been tucked away in a shoebox for over a decade. She hesitated for a moment before pulling open the bottom drawer of the cabinet beside her. There, beneath neatly folded dish towels, was the object she hadn't touched since the night her life changed forever. A championship belt, heavy and cool to the touch, the gold plate gleaming faintly even under the muted light. 4 silver stars lined the edge, each representing a world title she had fought for and won. She held it in her lap and closed her eyes, and in an instant, she was no longer in her apartment in Chicago. She was back in Las Vegas, 2013, standing under the blinding arena lights, the roar of the crowd pounding in her chest like a second heartbeat. Her opponent that night was a Brazilian striker known for ending fights in the first round. The commentators had said Eleanor didn't have a chance, but the cage door had shut, and the noise had faded until it was just her breath, her stance, her focus. She remembered the snap of her jab finding its mark, the shift in her opponent's eyes when she realized she'd been outmatched. Less than 3 minutes later, Eleanor's hand was raised, and the announcer's voice boomed, and still, the undisputed champion, Eleanor Silent Thunder Thompson. She could still see Daniel in the front row, grinning wide, holding up a handmade sign that read, "Bring the Thunder Home." He had been her biggest supporter, her fiercest protector, the person who reminded her who she was on the days she wanted to quit. And then, as the memory played out, it shifted, because just a week after that victory came the phone call that ripped everything away. She had been packing for the title defense when her phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen, but it wasn't his voice on the other end. It was a state trooper, steady and grim, telling her there had been an accident. Drunk driver. Instant. She remembered the way her knees buckled, the belt she had just won clattering to the floor, the sound of her own breathing turning into a gasp she couldn't control. That was the day she walked away from MMA. She didn't announce it. She didn't hold a press conference. She just disappeared. Changed her last name to Harris, moved to Chicago, and poured her entire life into raising Maya, promising herself she'd never again need the part of her that could hurt someone to survive. But now, as she sat with the belt across her lap, the gloves by her side, and the echo of Nate's words replaying in her head, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd buried with Daniel. Lila showed up unannounced, letting herself in with the spare key Eleanor had given her years ago. "Still up?" she asked softly, her eyes immediately catching the belt on Eleanor's lap. "Haven't seen that in a long time." Eleanor gave a faint smile. "Neither have I." Lila sat across from her, resting her elbows on the table. "I came to warn you. Victor and Nate, they're planning something. I overheard Victor in the lobby tonight telling one of the other parents that they're going to make an example out of you. Said Nate's going to humiliate you in front of the whole school." Eleanor ran her hand slowly over the cool metal of the belt. "They think I'm just some mom sitting in the bleachers." "They don't know who you are," Lila said, her voice firm. Eleanor looked up, meeting her friend's gaze. "Then maybe it's time they found out." For a long moment. The room was silent except for the muffled sound of a car passing on the street below. Finally, Lila leaned back. "If you're going to do this, you can't just walk in there cold. You've got to train. Get your timing back. You've been out for 12 years. Ellie." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Timing's muscle memory, and I never lost it." Still, after Lila left, Eleanor rolled up the worn area rug in her living room, taped off a small square of floor with athletic tape, and began to move. At first, it was slow, shadowboxing, working the angles, feeling out her balance, but soon the rhythm returned. Jab, cross, slip, pivot, hook. Her body remembered. The burn in her shoulders felt like an old friend. The next hour passed in a blur of strikes, sprawls, and footwork drills. When she finally stopped, chest heaving, sweat dripping down her spine, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. She didn't see Maya's mom anymore. She saw Silent Thunder, the fighter who had faced opponents twice her size and never backed down. She touched the photo of Daniel on the wall as she passed. "This one's for you," she whispered, that night, as she lay in bed. Her mind didn't wander to the life she'd built after MMA. It stayed locked on the moment Nate would throw down the challenge. She could see it already. The crowd gathered, Victor smirking from the sidelines, Maya watching with wide eyes, and she could see exactly how she'd answer. Not just for herself, but for every kid on that mat who had been made to feel less than. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and let the memories of the cage play one more time in her mind. The fight wasn't here yet, but in her heart. It had already begun, the following afternoon. The atmosphere inside Elite Warriors felt different, charged, like the air before a storm. Parents clustered along the walls, whispering, their eyes flicking toward Eleanor every so often. She could feel the shift, could sense that whatever Nate and Victor had been scheming was about to unfold. Victor stood near the entrance in another one of his tailored suits, coffee in hand, chatting with a pair of parents like a politician working a crowd. Nate was on the mat, leading warm-ups, his voice carrying with that mix of authority and arrogance Eleanor had come to recognize. Halfway through the session, Victor clapped his hands once, sharp, loud, and the chatter died instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with the false enthusiasm of a man who thinks he's about to deliver great entertainment, We're going to do something special today, a little exhibition match for our students. A ripple of excitement moved through the kids, some bouncing on their toes, others craning their necks to see what was happening. Nate stepped forward, scanning the crowd with mock consideration before his gaze landed on Eleanor. "Mrs. Harris," he called, voice dripping with that same condescension he'd used days earlier. "Why don't you come up here? Show the kids how a supportive mom gets involved. You've been watching from the sidelines for months. Let's see if you've learned anything." A couple of parents chuckled. Victor's smirk widened. Lila's sharp intake of breath beside Eleanor was the only sound she registered for a moment. Eleanor rose slowly, unzipping her jacket and setting it neatly on the bench. She stepped onto the mat, her posture calm, but her eyes locked on Nate. "Fine," she said evenly. "But if I win, you and Victor apologize, publicly, for how you've treated certain students." The gym went silent for a beat before bursting into a mix of laughter and murmurs. Nate arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "If you win?" He looked over at Victor, who was openly grinning now. "Sure, Mrs. Harris, whatever you say." "No," Eleanor replied, her tone dropping low, the steel beneath it unmistakable. "Say it now, out loud, in front of them." Victor chuckled but nodded. "If you win, I'll apologize. We both will. But when Nate puts you on the mat in 30 seconds, you'll owe him a thank you for going easy." The deal hung in the air, and Eleanor simply said, "Then let's begin." Lila's eyes met hers for a brief second, part worry, part awe. Nate turned to grab his gloves, tossing a pair toward Eleanor like a bone thrown to a dog. She caught them without flinching, slipped them on, and rolled her shoulders around them. The students pressed closer to the edge of the mat. Maya stood near the back, her hands clasped tight, her eyes wide with confusion and worry. She knew her mom was strong, but she had never seen this side of her. Not the way she moved now, measured and coiled, as if every step was calculated. Nate bounced lightly on his feet, grinning like he was about to teach a lesson he'd enjoy. Victor leaned on the railing. Sipping his coffee like this was a casual Sunday show. 3 minutes, Nate announced to the crowd. "That's all it'll take." Eleanor didn't respond. She simply settled into a stance that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen a professional fight. Light on her toes, chin tucked, guard high. Lila's mouth twitched into the barest hint of a smile. They didn't know what was coming. That night, Eleanor didn't go home and collapse like she usually did after a long day. Instead, she met Lila at the small park near Lake Michigan, under the dim light of a flickering lamppost. She ran drills, footwork, pivots, shadow strikes. Lila held the pads, bracing with each thud as Eleanor's punches landed solid and clean. "You're still fast," Lila said, shaking out her hands after a particularly sharp combo. "Faster than him." Eleanor just nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "Speed's not the problem. It's control. I don't want to hurt him. I just want to make sure he can't claim I got lucky." Lila smirked. "Make it clean. Then, embarrass him without breaking him." They trained until nearly midnight, the sounds of Eleanor's strikes echoing off the lakefront. As they packed up, Lila hesitated. "You sure you're ready for the fallout? Because after tomorrow, you won't be invisible anymore." Eleanor paused, tightening the strap on her gym bag. "I was invisible to protect Maya. But if staying invisible means letting men like Nate teach her she's less than, then I'm done hiding." Back in her apartment, she placed the championship belt on the table where she'd see it in the morning. It wasn't about glory, not anymore. It was about principle, about showing her daughter, and every kid in that academy, that respect is earned by how you treat people, not by how loud you are or how much money you have. The next day, the whole academy would know exactly who she was, and she had no intention of giving Nate or Victor the easy victory they were banking on by the next afternoon. Word had spread through the Elite Warriors Martial Arts Academy like wildfire, and the place was packed far beyond a normal training day. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, some with their phones out. Students crowded at the edges of the mat, and even a few people from neighboring businesses had wandered in to see what the buzz was about. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that hums just before a big fight, though most in the room thought they were about to watch a one-sided spectacle. Nate Brooks, dressed in his crisp black jai, paced in the center of the mat with a grin so smug it almost dared someone to wipe it off his face. Victor Caldwell leaned against the railing with his arms crossed, his gold watch catching the overhead lights, looking like a man convinced the outcome was already written. Eleanor stepped forward from the bench, wearing plain workout gear, black leggings, a fitted gray top, no gi, no belt. She didn't need them. Her presence alone was different today, calm, unhurried, but with an unmistakable gravity. Maya stood off to the side, anxiety etched into her young face, and Lila was a few steps behind her, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets as if to keep from clapping too soon. Nate raised his voice, addressing the crowd. "All right, folks, just a friendly exhibition. 3 minutes. Let's see if Mrs. Harris here can survive without pulling a muscle." Laughter rippled through the room. Eleanor said nothing. She simply walked to the center, touched her gloves together in the customary gesture of respect, and took her stance. Light on her feet, guard high, eyes locked on Nate's chest. A few older students squinted, recognizing the form immediately. The whistle blew. Nate came forward fast, a flurry of jabs meant to overwhelm her early. Eleanor didn't move backward. She pivoted, her body turning just enough for each strike to graze harmlessly past. The crowd made small noises, surprise, confusion, at the ease with which she read him. Nate's grin faltered, and he came in harder, trying a quick combination into a low sweep. Eleanor stepped aside, catching his momentum with her forearm and guiding him past as if he were a beginner. She didn't throw a punch yet. She didn't need to. Each miss chipped away at his confidence, and the onlookers began to sense it. Victor's smirk had tightened into something less certain. 30 seconds in, Nate lunged with a high roundhouse, and Eleanor moved like lightning, ducking under, pivoting behind him, and tapping the back of his neck with a gloved fist in the clean, precise motion of a knockout strike. She pulled it, of course, but the message was clear. If she wanted to, it would be over. Gasps erupted around the room. "Was that?" one parent whispered before cutting themselves off. Nate spun, jaw tight, and now his movements carried something uglier. Frustration. He swung wider, abandoned his clean form, and tried to muscle her down with brute strength. Eleanor let him commit, sidestepping again, this time adding a light push to his shoulder that sent him stumbling to one knee. The crowd murmured louder. A couple of students glanced at their phones, pulling up old fight clips. Within moments, whispers began to spread. Silent thunder. Could it be? Nate's breathing had grown heavy, his cheeks flushed. He charged again, and Eleanor met him head-on this time, deflecting his strike and answering with a single, measured hook to his midsection, not enough to hurt him badly, but enough to knock the wind out of him and send him back a step. The sound of glove against body was sharp, decisive. Victor pushed off the railing, his coffee long forgotten, his face tightening with disbelief. "Come on!" "Nate!" he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. But Nate's swings grew sloppier, his timing shattered by the realization that he wasn't controlling this fight. With just under a minute left, Eleanor decided to end it. Nate came forward in one last desperate flurry, and she slipped every punch, closing the distance until they were chest to chest. With one swift, fluid motion, she hooked her foot behind his, twisted her hips, and sent him down flat on his back, her glove resting lightly against his cheek as the whistle blew. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, applause, all at once. Maya's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and pride. Lila let out a low whistle, and then Eleanor straightened, stepping back, pulling her gloves off slowly. She turned to Victor first, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "I believe we had an agreement." Victor's face reddened, but before he could speak, a voice from the crowd shouted, "She's silent thunder! Look!" Phones were held high now, screens showing old clips. Eleanor in the cage, her hand raised in victory, that same composed expression on her face. The realization swept through the room like a wave. Parents stared, students buzzed, and Nate, still catching his breath on the mat, closed his eyes briefly before looking up at her. He knew he'd been beaten clean. "I apologize," he said, the words stiff but audible, "for the way I treated you, and your daughter." Victor hesitated, but the weight of the crowd's eyes, and the dozens of recording phones, forced his hand. "I was wrong," he said, each word tasting bitter. "I shouldn't have encouraged favoritism. I apologize to you and to anyone who felt disrespected." Eleanor nodded once. "Respect isn't about belts or titles. It's about how you treat people. Every single day." Then she turned and walked to Maya, who threw her arms around her mother, the pride on her face shining brighter than any championship gold. The match was over, but the real victory had just begun. The gym was still buzzing long after the match had ended, students replaying the takedown in slow motion on their phones, parents whispering to each other, and kids, especially the ones who had been on the receiving end of Nate's double standards, looking at Eleanor like she was someone out of a legend. Nate sat on the edge of the mat, gloves off, head down, sweat still dripping from his temples. The flush of exertion had faded, replaced by something more complicated. Embarrassment. Yes. But also the dawning realization that he had been exposed, not just as a man who had underestimated someone, but as an instructor who had failed the very principles he claimed to teach. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet and walked toward Eleanor, who stood near the edge of the mat with Maya and Lila at her side. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were on her. "I was wrong," he said again, louder this time, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "I treated some of my students differently because of my own biases. I disrespected you and your daughter. That ends today." A murmur of surprise and approval swept through the room. Maya's grip on Eleanor's arm tightened, and Eleanor gave her a small squeeze in return. Victor Caldwell, however, was still leaning against the railing, his jaw clenched, eyes darting around as if looking for a way to reclaim control of the narrative. He had been a man used to owning the room, and now he stood in one where he was the least trusted person, but with so many phones still recording. He had no choice. Eleanor turned her gaze toward him, calm and unyielding. "Your turn, Victor." He straightened, his smile returning in a brittle, forced way. "I already said." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm. "Say it to them, to the students, to the parents, to the kids you've been telling aren't worth your time." Victor's eyes swept over the crowd, every one of them watching, waiting. The weight of their stares and the reality that this moment would live forever online seemed to sink in. He cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflinks, and said, "I was wrong. I let my personal opinions affect how I encourage this academy to be run. I apologize to every student here, and to you, Mrs. Harris, and to Maya. I'll do better." It wasn't warm or heartfelt, but it was public, and it was on the record. Eleanor didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply said, "Hold yourself to that." Then she turned back to the students. "Martial arts is about discipline, respect, and fairness. If you take anything from what you saw today, Let it be this. Real strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how you treat people when you think no one's watching. A few kids clapped, then more joined in. Soon the entire gym was filled with applause, not the rowdy, competitive kind, but the steady, affirming kind that speaks of agreement. Nate stepped aside, gesturing for Eleanor to address the class. She didn't lecture long, but her words hit their mark. She spoke about the importance of lifting each other up, about how talent comes from every background, and about never letting someone else's prejudice define your worth. Victor shifted uncomfortably throughout, but he didn't interrupt. When she was done, Maya hugged her again, this time with tears in her eyes. "I've never been more proud of you," she whispered. Lila, standing nearby, grinned and said, "Told you they had no idea who they were messing with," as the crowd began to disperse. Nate approached her again, this time without the stiffness in his posture. "I'd like you to come back," he said. "Not just as a parent. Maybe teach a class. Share what you know." Eleanor studied him for a moment, weighing whether the offer came from sincerity or from a need to repair his image. But she saw the shift in his eyes. Not a full transformation yet, but the start of one. "We'll see," she said. Not committing, but not shutting the door either. Victor didn't linger. He shook a few hands on his way out, but no one seemed eager to engage. By the time he reached the door, his usual commanding presence had deflated, replaced by the look of a man who'd been reminded that money can't buy respect. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Eleanor and Maya stepped into the cool air, Lila right behind them. Maya clutched her mother's hand. "Are you going to tell me everything now?" Eleanor glanced down at her daughter and smiled faintly. "I'll tell you enough to know why I did what I did. The rest, you'll learn when you need it." Lila laughed. "That's the most mom answer I've ever heard." They walked together toward the car, the weight of the last few days finally starting to lift. Inside the gym, a few of the older students were still huddled over their phones, watching clips of the fight again, their voices full of awe. Nate, left alone on the mat, stood quietly for a moment before turning to look at the space where Eleanor had stood, whatever else he might have been before today. He knew one thing for certain. His approach had to change, and from the look in the students' eyes, he knew they'd hold him to it. For Eleanor, the fight was over, but the message would linger long after the mats were cleared. A month later, the ripple effects of that afternoon at Elite Warriors were still being felt, not just inside the academy, but in the wider Chicago martial arts community. What had started as a planned humiliation by Nate and Victor had instead become the most talked-about moment the Academy had ever seen, thanks to half a dozen videos that had gone viral on social media, clips of Eleanor's footwork, her calm evasion, and the flawless sweep that sent Nate to the mat had been replayed millions of times online. Usually with captions like, "Respect is earned," "Not given," or "Silent Thunder lives." Strangers had sent messages from across the country, former fighters, young girls in karate classes, parents who had seen their kids treated unfairly, thanking her for standing up not just for Maya, but for every student who had been overlooked or underestimated. Inside the academy, the atmosphere had shifted. The old tension had eased. Nate now ran classes with an even hand, offering corrections and praise equally, regardless of a student's background or skin color. The kids noticed. So did the parents. In place of the whispered complaints Eleanor used to hear on the benches, she now overheard encouragement, quiet praise, and talk of upcoming tournaments with genuine excitement. Nate had even introduced a new rule during sparring sessions. Every student had to partner with someone they didn't know well, forcing the walls between cliques to come down. It was a small change, but Eleanor could see it was working. Victor, true to his word, had stepped back from his overbearing presence in the gym, while he had withdrawn his official sponsorship. He made an unexpected move. He began funding scholarships for underprivileged kids in Chicago to join martial arts programs around the city. Lila suspected it was partly for public image repair, but Eleanor didn't care. Good money was finally going toward a good cause. Maya, for her part, had blossomed. Just 2 weeks after the match, she earned her green belt, and this time, when Nate tied it around her waist, he did it with a smile that reached his eyes. Eleanor had never seen her daughter stand so tall. One Saturday morning, the academy hosted a Unity in the Dojo event, open to the public, with free classes and demonstrations. Eleanor had agreed to run a special session for girls and women, focusing on self-defense and confidence in movement. The mats were full. Teenagers, college students, even a few moms, watching intently as she demonstrated techniques. She didn't lecture them on her past. She just showed them how to move, how to stand, how to take up space without apology. At the end of the class, one young girl with braids and bright eyes asked shyly, "Are you really Silent Thunder?" Eleanor smiled, crouching to meet her gaze. "I was... But you? You can be whatever name you choose for yourself." The girl grinned like she'd been given a secret. As the day wound down, parents and students mingled, sharing food and stories, the gym buzzing with an energy Eleanor hadn't felt there before. She caught Nate watching her from across the room, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet respect. He gave a small nod. She returned it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over Lake Michigan, Eleanor and Maya walked home from the train station, the city's golden skyline behind them. Maya carried her belt draped over her shoulder like a badge of honor. "You think I'll ever be as good as you?" she asked, half serious. Eleanor glanced at her, eyes soft. "Better. You'll be better, and you'll fight your battles in your own way." Maya grinned, kicking at a stray pebble. "Maybe I'll be the next Silent Thunder." Eleanor laughed quietly. "Or maybe you'll be the first Storm Harris." They reached their building just as the streetlights blinked on, before heading inside. Eleanor paused, looking out at the lake, the wind tugging gently at her hair. She thought about Daniel, about the promise she had made to herself after his death, and how this unexpected turn of events had brought her full circle, not back into the cage, but back into the fight for something that mattered. She realized now that she hadn't stepped onto that mat just to defend her daughter. She had stepped onto it to remind herself that walking away from the sport hadn't meant walking away from her voice. As they climbed the stairs, Maya slipped her hand into hers. "I'm glad you didn't stay invisible," she said. Eleanor squeezed her hand in reply. "So am I." And with that, they disappeared into the warm light of their apartment, leaving the city behind for the night, knowing that the legacy of that one fight, that one stand, would keep echoing long after the cheers had faded. Thank you for watching and supporting these stories. Like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear this message.